All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. And I'm happy to welcome back friend of the show, Jonathan Taplin. He's the director emeritus of the Annenberg Innovation Lab at USC. He began his career in 1969 as tour manager for Bob Dylan and the band. And his most recent book, which we had you on back in 2023 to talk about, and I just reran on the audio podcast, is called The End of Reality, How Billionaires Are Selling a Fantasy Future of the Metaverse, Mars, and Crypto. Jonathan Taplin, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be here, Matt.
Like I said, I reran our conversation because I think actually it's probably more relevant today than it was in 2023, right? So you were ahead of the curve, big time. The latest, as we're recording this, federal workers received an email on Saturday from Elon Musk, basically telling them, tell me what you did, 5 bullet points of what you did last week. And if you want to keep your job, you better reply. That was effectively the gist of it. Let me ask, do you think this is Elon Musk, these business tactics, did they work in Silicon Valley? And if so, do they apply to government?
Well, it didn't really work at Twitter, which he sent the same email out to every employee of Twitter. They fired too many people, and then they had to hire a bunch of them back. But that being said, it's a lot easier to do that at Twitter than it is to do it with the whole federal government. And obviously, a lot of people who I take to be maybe the Bannon faction, Kash Patel, the defense secretary, Tulsi Gabbard, are pushing back against this and saying basically to their employees, ignore that email you got from Elon because we run this department and he doesn't. And I think, he's really drinking his own Kool-Aid. He thinks he's in charge of the whole country. And, nobody ever accused him of not having a huge ego, but I think he's running into some problems here. Maybe. We'll see.
This Department of Government Efficiency sounds like a startup culture experiment on a national scale. Talk, if you would, where does this worldview come from? Has he always kind of had this mentality? I mean, you had an earlier book, I think it was called Move Fast and Break Things, which was the unofficial motto of Facebook. It seems like that's the motto right now that they're employing when it comes to government. They're moving fast, they're breaking things. I'm not sure if that if that ports well into the world of government.
Well, there has always been this theory of creative destruction, right? Which was kind of the ethos of Silicon Valley, but it doesn't really apply that well to the kind of institutions. I have a friend who was a classmate of mine in high school who ran the Africa division of USAID for agriculture for 20 years. And he can point to hundreds of great things that they did to improve the agricultural output of African countries and to bring the Norman Borlaug Green Revolution and that was the earlier Green Revolution, to Africa, and now he says it's gone. It's all gone. And that probably is not a good idea. You and I have talked a lot about the role of soft power in the world, and I have always been a believer that America's true exceptionalism has been its artistic, creative output, its inventors, its musicians, its painters, its filmmakers, and that they had so much more power and importance than the military. I mean, I think I told you once that I was in Berlin in 1989 making a movie with a German director named Wim Wenders, and it was called Until the End of the World. And the thesis of the movie was that the Berlin Wall came down in 2000. And here we were making this movie in 1989. And during the course of production, the Berlin Wall came down. And we had gotten a little vision of that 6 months before. We would go over to East Berlin through Checkpoint Charlie to the only large soundstage in Berlin, which was called Babelsberg. And we would work all day in this big soundstage. And when we'd finish, we'd go to the cafeteria, which was like a bar with three very large TVs, which you never saw in East Germany, on the wall. And because it was a state communications facility, they had a satellite. And guess what was on the wall playing on the TVs at 6:30 at night where all the workers were drinking beer? It was MTV Europe. And they were dancing to Michael Jackson. They were already over the wall emotionally. They were all
Hmm.
wearing U2 t-shirts and Levi's, and they were, for all extents, in the other side of the wall, except they would tell us that they had to be very careful that their neighbors didn't rat on them for playing loud rock music or
Yeah.
smoking hash, you know? And so they were also in a fear culture, which is, of course, what we're developing now, you know?
I wonder why that. And by the way, I believe that politics is downstream from culture, and there's look at how we ended up with Donald Trump. Is it a surprise? 20 years ago, you start off with like reality TV shows. You start off with the anti-hero. There's so many cultural trends that probably led us eventually to Donald Trump. And it's a combination of things. I wonder why this didn't work in China. I think this was part of the rationale for opening up trade to China, that we would that our culture would, for lack of a better word, sort of infect them, and that liberalization and political freedom would inexorably follow commercial or economic freedom. And for whatever reason, it didn't work there.
Well, it did to some extent, in the sense that, you know, I would have students at USC, which are a lot of Chinese master's students. So the master's program in communication at USC has no scholarships. So everybody's paying the full rate, which is 40,000 a year. And some of my seminars were 20 people in them, and 18 of them were Chinese. And I used to call them, and most of them were women, and I used to call them kiddingly my little red princesses, because they were all daughters of the party leaders. And they wore the latest Chanel, and they had the right purse, and they had everything Western in the way they dressed and the music they listened to. But on the other hand, when I showed them a film of Ai Weiwei, and, very a dissident Chinese, they had never heard of him. He had been blocked out of their consciousness completely. So I think the party was very good at controlling things, and clearly not allowing Google was a very strategic, good move on their part. In other words, you could have the internet, but it was their internet. It was a
Hmm.
completely cut off internet. And so, as opposed to other parts like the Eastern Europe situation, where there was Václav Havel inviting Frank Zappa to come because the plastic people had been the key of the revolution that he had made. Uh, and the plastic people were mothers of invention spin-off, so to
This
speak.
is a band, a rock band that you're talking about,
Yeah,
right? The
yeah.
Plastic
There,
People, and Havel was the kind of resistance leader who was a poet, I think, or am I right?
yeah, he was a
Yeah.
poet and a playwright. And his Charter 99 movement never took off until this band started telling their fans to sign up. And that's when the big explosion happened. And that band loved the mothers of invention. And so when Havel ascended to what they call the White House in their government presidential palace, his first guest was not a politician. It was Frank Zappa. I have a great picture of the two of them talking, smoking cigarettes.
I was a little surprised this past election. I thought that, for example, Taylor Swift would have more influence, just because of her immense popularity, especially with young people, especially with young women. and that she would really kind of utilize that popularity to lead voter drives. And I'm not sure what went wrong there, but it obviously didn't manifest. Or it if it did, whatever Trump was doing to reach young men, gamers or whatever, surpassed the Taylor Swift effect.
Well, look, Elon Musk has 220 million followers, and he told every one of them at least 5 to 10 times a day that the Democrats were the center of evil, of everything wrong with the world, and that they had to be gotten rid of. And, if you look at what happened to those young, and most of them were men, those young men, of course, they went along with whatever he suggested, and they're still doing it. I mean, he is able to deploy his mob, his online mob, in very powerful ways. On Sunday, he called out the guy at the Pentagon who wrote the letter saying, "You don't need to comply with this memo." Uh, he called him out, and the guy got just a bomb of hatred, death threats, everything. So, I mean, it's not that dissimilar from the brown shirts, quite honestly.
We were talking
But
about China. I should have mentioned Elon Musk's many dealings with China. So he basically is we'll sell them stuff and let them have their own sphere of influence. Let them do what they want to do in their country as long as we're making money. So he's one of the people that I think, maybe if American Google, Meta, uh, you know, um, if Musk and Tesla, if they had kind of put their foot down and said, we're not going to trade with you unless you treat your people a certain way, maybe they could have had some influence, but they were more than happy to just cash in and look the other way.
yeah, which is why, even the biggest, maybe leaning media executive is kissing the ring. I mean, when you think about CBS being willing to give Trump $10 million because they edited 60 Minutes, right? I mean, CBS, I was on 60 Minutes once. They shoot 60 times as much footage
Yes.
as they need. Editing is the key part of
Hmm.
documentaries. And you may do a 2 hour interview with Kamala Harris and use 10 minutes of it. So what? I mean, and why did they do that? Because the FCC threatened Sherry Redstone that they might disallow her merger, her finally getting liquid after all these years. They might stop it. Uh, it's just, it's pretty brutal.
Now, another story that happened recently involving Musk is he's apparently, reportedly having his 13th child that we know of. I think it's four different women. I'm not sure. But here's the weird thing. Apparently, because I would think, okay, I get it. I get it. Uh, you want to have sex with women. You know what I mean? You want to be a rock star. But apparently he's using IVF to conceive. What are we to make of that?
Well, I wrote the other day that he's like the Johnny Appleseed of sperm donors. He believes that his DNA is so perfect that the more he can spread it around, the better the human race will be. Um, but that comes back to your earliest question. I mean, what is unique about Musk? Well, for one thing, he believes that the Earth is not going to survive. That's why he wants to go to Mars. He thinks that at some point, all of this will end in catastrophe. And so he comes at almost every single question of thinking about the world from that kind of very dark existential notion. Now, anybody who's studied, as I did, what actually life on Mars would be like would be it's a hellscape. You couldn't go out of your little bubble. You'd be trapped there forever. The radiation levels, if you actually went out on the surface of Mars, would give you cancer in 25 minutes. It's an insane idea. And of course, Trump now wants to do it. And, my calculations of what the cost of one trip with 10 people was somewhere on the level of $20 trillion. And Musk, he takes about a 30% cut of all that money that the Pentagon pays him or that NASA pays him. So that's a really good payday for Elon.
It would be. Um, so you talk a lot about how Musk and Thiel are reshaping society's goals. If someone wanted to counterbalance their influence, what would be the most effective strategy?
Federalism. In other words, I think you and I talked a little bit about this last time. I believe that the original Jeffersonian conception of the country was that the states are independent as to everything they do internally and dependent to everything they do externally with other states, other countries. So Jefferson knew that America was, as Colin Woodward has written and everybody else, that America was made up of a lot of different societies,
Hmm.
cultures, Appalachian cultures, New England cultures, all these various cultures. And on some ways, for someone like myself who's grew up in folk music, that was the brilliance of this country, you know, the diversity of it. But what's happening now is Trump wants to tell everybody what to do. So New York can't have, congestion pricing. California can't ban assault weapons. Uh, you know, New Jersey can't ban abortion. It's all like more and more consolidation of power in the executive. And I know he thinks he wants to be king and he should be king, but that's not the way this country was designed. It was designed as a federalist thing. And so it's not unusual that the attorney generals in the blue states are the main real opposition force to what he's doing. They're suing him. They've sued him about 10 times already, and they'll continue to sue him. Now, whether he abides by court rulings or not is an open question. It would seem that taking birthright citizenship away as it's ensconced in the 14th Amendment seems a pretty high lift, even for Clarence Thomas, you
Hmm.
know, but who knows, you know?
Yeah. We could lose Thomas and Alito in a case like that, in my opinion. I
You
think that
think you
I
think
think
they
the
would
right side would prevail, but I don't think it would be unanimous, actually.
right,
So
which would be pretty remarkable.
it would be because it's obviously pretty much an open and shut case.
Yeah.
One time we talked, it wasn't last time, but one time we talked, and you really helped me understand how the assassination of Bobby Kennedy was this huge deal that really, when that happened, that was kind of the last gasp of people really of a certain age,
Right,
people really believing in something, or that
right.
it really crushed. I want to say utopian, but a lot of the dreams about what America could be, and you really helped me appreciate that to a degree I never had before. Um, I'm wondering, what do you make of RFK Jr. in light of that?
Well, first, I think it's important because, I've got the gray hair here, you don't. It's important for your listeners to understand how meaningful the spring of 1968 was in changing everything. In other words, we had been battling both the civil rights problem and the Vietnam War problem, my generation. And I was a junior in Princeton in 1968. And that, after Bobby Kennedy declared that he was going to run for president against a sitting president, that was the first sign that maybe the racial problem could be healed, the war could be ended, and inequality, which was an issue he talked about all the time. And it wasn't racial. He would go to Appalachia
Hmm.
and talk about how poor those people were, and people living in shacks with no plumbing, and how that has to end. And so between the optimism of Martin Luther King being willing to take on the war as well as the civil rights problem, and the optimism of Bobby Kennedy. And remember, in those days, the Democrats represented both the working class and the knowledge class. So there was a real possibility that you could have had this coalition that worked, and Bobby Kennedy, in my mind, would have become president for sure. Uh, but what happened with killing Martin Luther King and then killing Bobby Kennedy was that those of us who had really invested a lot of energy into politics thought, fuck it, man. It just
Yeah.
break your heart. It'll just break your heart. And so I went off and joined the circus. I went to work for Bob Dylan and the band and went on tour. And, eventually I graduated from Princeton, and then I didn't look back. But think of something else, which kind of relates to this new book. So Richard Nixon becomes president in 68. And then you have a cultural renaissance of such proportion while Nixon is in office. If you look at the history of American film, there has never been a greater period from 1969 to 1979. That is we call it the American New Wave. Francis Coppola, Marty Scorsese, Bob Rafelson, Hal Ashby, Bill Friedkin, just the cream, Robert
Yeah.
Altman, the best of the best. And the same thing in the music business. Unbelievable things happening in the American music business because the Brits had kind of pulled back. I mean, the Beatles were kind of out of the business, and it was the Eagles and the band and Dylan and all that. And so I make the argument that these eras of right-wing repression often lead to incredible eras of cultural renaissance. You think about Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker in 1952, while McCarthy is out there railing against the commies, they're making breakthrough after breakthrough in terms of new music, new poetry, new ways of writing. It's extraordinary. You go back farther to the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge comes in, the Ku Klux Klan rises, and then you have Louis Armstrong, Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Upton Sinclair. You have this explosion of brilliant stuff being made. And so my hope is that the artists are going to begin to wake up. There's a certain kind of romantic sense of the role the artist plays. Um, didn't escape to me that there's a review in the Washington Post of the Caspar David Friedrich show at the Metropolitan Museum, which is this most romantic vision of what nature is about. And this show is like sold out. You can't get a ticket to get in there if your life depended on it. So somebody's interested in something, a more romantic vision of what life can be. And this happens time and
Hmm.
time and time again. You can go, I
Yeah. I
mean,
mean, I think you're probably right. I believe a backlash is coming, and it wouldn't surprise me if the backlash included art and culture. And but on the other hand, I have to let me just be a little, you know, praised here or paranoid. We are seeing, Trump took over the Kennedy Center. You've got people even like Snoop Dogg performing at Trump's inauguration at one of the balls. And look, in America, I think you're right that there has been this backlash. This machine kills fascists. But Leni Riefenstahl was a very talented, you know, All tour. So, I'm a little concerned, but am I hyperventilating here?
Okay, no. Well, first off, Snoop Dogg is a sellout. He's been a sellout for 15 years. How many ads do you see Snoop Dogg in? He's a fucking handler. He's just he's a shill. He'll shill for anybody as long as the check will clear. Um, as far as I have a friend, Greil Marcus, who's probably one of the great music critics of all time, and he's written all the seminal books on Dylan and all that. And I wrote him and I said, Greil, what happened to the counterculture? And he said, Tap, you might have to consider that the counterculture war was won by the left, but now it could be that white nationalism is the counterculture.
Yeah.
And I said to him, okay, but where's the culture part of that? I understand it's the counter politics, but if you're telling me that, you know,
Well, it used to, I will say
these
this, and so I had a friend, that I've been telling for a while that, like, conservatism, this is before Trump came on, but I was trying to make the case that conservatism is the new punk rock. Um, but I do think now we have arrived at a point where, like, if you wanna be, like, cool and transgressive and freak out the normies in the establishment, um, it's kind of to go to the Musk Trump side, right? Which is a
I,
rapid departure.
I disagree.
Okay.
So look, Kid Rock will never be cool. Kid Rock is an asshole, and
He
he
might have been
writes,
slightly cool in 1998.
yeah, but he's not. I mean, in 25 years, I promise I'll be dead, but you'll still be listening to Bruce Springsteen, and you won't be listening to Kid Rock. He will have disappeared down the memory hole. Hulk Hogan will be a little asterisk. So what culturally has Trump sponsored? Okay, the Kennedy Center is meaningless. Did you follow what was going on at the Kennedy Center every week? Of course you didn't. You maybe noticed that there was something called the Kennedy Center Awards once a year, and that was about your only implication of the. So who cares? It doesn't pass the who cares test that Trump takes it over. And if he just programs, Lee Greenwood at the Kennedy Center, who cares? It's meaningless. They will never be cool. And so they don't have a Leni Riefenstahl. Steve Bannon was the closest thing they had to a propaganda filmmaker. And he made these horrible films. I don't know if you ever had to subject yourself to one of the
Yeah.
Steve Bannon's propaganda films,
Sarah
but
Palin, the undefeated.
he was
Yeah.
a bad filmmaker. And they don't have, I mean, filmmakers I know come from a notion of empathy. And none of these people have any empathy. That's their problem. They're on the spectrum. I mean, not to make.
Actually, that is very true. I mean, I think back to Elon Musk, and it used to be. I honestly think if you look at Elon Musk, though, and you see him at CPAC this past week with the chainsaw and the sunglasses and the slightly fat belly protruding under the black t-shirt. I think when I was at Gen X, we would have laughed at that. That would have not been perceived as cool. That would have been pretty lame. I actually think that it's perceived as cool now. I've obviously lost the thread on what is hip, but I think that we would have mocked him and saw him as like trying too hard, sort of being a poser. Trump obviously would have been seen as a joke. I don't know that that's the case anymore.
Well, look, there are a lot of young men who feel that they can't have a place to stand in
Yeah.
American culture.
Yep.
My son, who is in his late 30s, has spoken of young men on social dating apps. So the skill set and the technique of young men is to like every woman that looks half attractive on the app and give it the thumbs up, the like. And the girls go through no, 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 no. They just swipe left, and
Yeah.
99% of the men get rejected
Yep.
every day. So how do you think that makes them feel?
And
They feel
the 1% of the guys are getting a ton of women,
right.
and you could be, um, rejected for various reasons too. They're not. It's not like they're meeting you and it's like, oh, his personality, he was sort of a jerk. It's like, no, whatever, some immutable reason that they're, swiping left. I've luckily I've never been on any of those apps.
Me
I
neither.
I'm too old for that, but
But they take to lying too. That's the second technique. Okay, having been rejected 99 times in a week, they tend to put things like, I'm in a crypto startup, right? Hoping that that's hard for someone to find out whether that's true or not. And then maybe they do get a date, but the girl is not stupid. She realizes pretty quickly the guy is driving a bad Toyota, they're at a bad restaurant. And then of course, as I see as a college professor, I could see that the women were getting all the good grades. I mean, the top of
mhm,
my classes were inevitably the top 10% were women. And that says to me they're probably getting the good jobs. And
mhm.
so then you have men going out where the women pays the bill. And yet these guys are still caught in a kind of Camelot, I'm the knight in shining armor thing. And so they feel shitty about that too. So I
It
mean,
makes them
look,
susceptible to radicalization by people like
totally.
Elon Musk, right?
Yeah. Who says
Totally.
ignore them, we'll just make our own world and we'll
Yeah,
somehow
ketamine, video
right,
games, porn, and soon
right,
sex robots. And at
right.
that point,
That's who needs women.
um, a lot of people feel overwhelmed by the speed of change in technology and politics. What spiritual, mental, intellectual models or practices, daily practices, do you recommend for staying informed without feeling paralyzed?
I would pretty much stay off of social media. I mean, I I read the New York Times online every day, and I know that's going to put me in a little box, but I do because I think it's still pretty balanced news, and I can get conservative opinion from Ross Douthat and those people, and I can get liberal opinion, although there's less of that now since Krugman left. Uh, and then I have
I say
occasional.
Doubt and Krugman. So we're we're reading the same people, but it's totally different pronunciations.
Okay, yeah, I never knew how to pronounce Ross's
You may
name.
be right.
No, no, you're probably right. um, but then there's a few Substacks that I read, and I think Substack is trying to do interesting things, but mostly I read history, because I think that one of the problems I notice, I don't teach at college anymore, but one of the problems I noticed was that most young people coming into freshman year in college have a very poor idea of the history of the world. And I'm really convinced that, as Mark Twain once said, supposedly, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I think that we can constantly see eras, and this new book I'm writing is really a history of the counterculture and how this cycle of repressive political regimes leading to cultural renaissance keeps repeating itself. And uh, usually it's the artists that lead the way. I mean, I actually think that we have to have a cultural revolution first, and then we'll get to a more balanced political revolution. But
Yeah,
part of that is just going back to what I said about federalism. We have to
right.
learn to live and let live. If the people of Mississippi want to ban abortion and have open carry and have cars spewing smoke out of the tailpipe like they used to. Go with it, because essentially people will vote with their feet. That's what
I
happened between 1920 and 1940. 7 million African Americans voted with their feet and said, I'm out of here. I'm out of Jim Crow land, and I'm going to Detroit or Chicago or Cleveland or someplace where I can get a job and where I can vote and where I can be a human being.
so I don't want to get bogged down in this debate. Yeah, this will be the next time you come.
Okay.
But I am concerned because I feel like my generation, Generation X, we were like very against selling out. Like selling out was the worst thing you could do, And if you've read Chuck Klosterman's book about the '90s, he talks about that ethos. And today, I think selling out is very much there is not really a stigma attached to it. And that goes to the artists, the rappers, the hip hop musicians, the country, whatever genre. And so that makes me concerned that they're going to be co-opted and bought off and intimidated. They're not going to
Right.
be like Jim Morrison, who's going to be like, F
No.
you, I'm going out and performing Light
Right.
My Fire, no matter what you say.
Right.
They don't have that rebellious attitude.
Right.
That's my concern, that you may be wrong about this time.
Okay. I totally agree with you that selling out is the ethos of the modern society. But that's probably why the culture is so flat. I mean, think about it. If you had said to uh, Pete Seeger or Joan Baez or somebody, hey, do an ad, or if you had said to Jack Nicholson or any actor, Marlon Brando, hey, do an ad, they would have thrown you out of the room. Literally. They would
Right.
have told you, are you crazy? And so that was a different time. And now basically everybody has sold out, but some people have sold out a lot more than others. I mean, the aforementioned Snoop Dogg is probably exhibit A in that. But the point is that there will come a time when, artists reject that. Now, there's this little subculture called Americana music, which
Yeah.
I've been involved in deeply.
Wait, I didn't know that because if you're talking like Pat Green, Ryan Adams, that kind of,
Right.
that's
R-
probably
Rhiannon
my favorite.
Giddens.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rhiannon Giddens. All these people, you know, they don't sell out. They're not interested in that in the least. And so maybe it starts in small ways where you have this beginnings of a new counterculture. Rachel Kusher says to me, no, it's more like subcultures, but it's okay. There could be a bunch of subcultures that reject the sellout routine, you know? So, but I agree with you that that's a big hurdle because advertising has become, and why is that? It's because Google, Facebook,
Yeah.
and Twitter, because
And
that's,
Napster too, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's a
but
different
that's
model. They're used to,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. But the point is that maybe those things will die. You know, there's no notion that we have to have Twitter or X. It could be that it right now, of course, everybody wants to suck up to Elon Musk, and so he's able to sell some debt at par. He's able to do all sorts of financial engineering. His net worth is up significantly. He gets to choose who runs NASA so that he gets all the money. He probably has something to do with who's going to run the missile part of the Air Force, so he gets all the money. And it's a classic crony capitalist thing that these guys are running, which is why the End of Reality is kind of an important book in the sense that
Hmm.
I think what you and I talked about a year and a half ago was, well, this is kind of like a kleptocracy, right? These guys are in it for themselves. They have no higher moral idea that they're trying to get to. They're just How much money can I make, and how can I get the government out of my life so they don't sue me for antitrust or do anything else? And that's why they love Trump.
Well, before I get you out of here, I gotta ask a couple music and movie questions. And I think a complete unknown won a Golden Globe, or Timothy Chalamet. Somebody did,
And,
and I
and he won the SAG award last night.
that's what it was. That's what I'm thinking
Yeah,
of actually last night,
yeah,
the SAG
best
Awards, and I think
actor.
maybe an Oscar is in the future. We'll see. What did you make of the movie and of Chalamet's performance?
I thought he was fabulous. I mean, having worked for Bob, I thought he channeled Bob's kind of nervous amphetamine and energy that sometimes was mean and sometimes was not so mean, and really well. Obviously, having been at Newport in 1965 for the famous incident,
When
they
Dylan goes electric.
right
Yeah.
they they over dramatized it. Most of that didn't happen the way they said it did. I mean, it all was much more spontaneous, and it wasn't like a plan that was going to be, we're going to disrupt this thing. I mean, it was a very simple thing. You know, Paul Butterfield's blues band on Saturday afternoon went on stage about 200 yards from a workshop that Alan Lomax was having with Mississippi John Hurd and Son House, uh, and who played acoustic guitars. And he heard the electric guitar and he went batshit. And he went over to the stage and he literally did try and unplug Mike Bloomfield's guitar amplifier. And Albert Grossman did wrestle him to the ground. And then Albert and myself and Jeff Moldar and a few other people walked back to the artist tent and regaled Dylan, who was in the artist tent backstage, of what had happened. And I don't know this is for sure, but I think that's the moment that Bob said, well, screw it. If Alan Lomax doesn't want rock and roll, I'll give him real rock and roll. And so literally in an hour, the whole thing was put together. We'll get Butterfield's rhythm section. We'll get Bloomfield because he played on Like a Rolling Stone. We'll bring Al Cooper in from New York to play the organ part because that's critical for Like a Rolling Stone. And it was all thrown together, not rehearsed. And part of the reaction on Sunday night was it was not rehearsed. It was not very good. It just didn't hang together. And Bloomfield kept turning up his guitar, and Peter Yarrow didn't have a clue how to mix it. And but I promise you, people were not throwing shit at the stage or none of that happened. People were booing for sure.
So in the movie, Pete Seeger is among the people who approach Dylan and
But
try to talk him into, hey man, you can play electric if you want some other time, but just this is a folk festival. Out of reverence, out of respect, you just do one set that's acoustic and then be on your way. And in watching the movie, my sense was like, so first of all, a great portrayal of Pete Seeger. I thought that was a really
wonderful. Ed Norton,
great
great.
portrayal.
Yeah.
But I'm like, Dylan should have a little reverence and respect and loyalty for Seeger, who really helped make him, at least according to the movie. And so it seemed to me to be a little bit uncool that Dylan didn't defer to him. But was that a misrepresentation of the facts?
Pete Seeger was upset, but he was more upset because he thought it was very badly mixed and it was too loud and everything. But from Bob's point of view, there had been electric music at Newport for 3 years. Muddy Waters had played Newport. Howlin' Wolf had played Newport.
Yeah, I
Paul
even think there's some of
Butterfield,
that in the movie, right?
yeah,
Actually, shots of
Paul
that.
Butterfield played Newport. So, I mean, Bob was saying, well, why can't I do that? And what you really think about is that from Pete Seeger and from the real folky broadside, you know, Irwin Silber people, he was betraying them because he wasn't singing protest songs.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted a protest singer. They wanted topical songs, and we're all going to overcome, and the times they are changing, and it's blowing in the wind. And he didn't want to sing that anymore. And you know, in the book I wrote about that era, the Magic Years, I talked about how Bob was freaked out when Kennedy got killed,
Bobby?
and
When Bobby or JFK? You're talking about Bobby, right?
JFK
Oh,
when
JFK.
JFK got killed. So in the winter of '64, I mean, the 3, 4, 5 months afterwards, you can see a real change in what Bob is beginning to do. And Highway 61, which comes out in the summer of '64, has some electric music on it, and it has no protest songs.
Mm.
And I think he just thought, I don't want to be a spokesman, but also I don't want to be a target of some crazy,
Mm-hmm.
and if you contrast that to the summer of '63 when he was in Mississippi playing benefits for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in places where civil rights workers were killed, that's a big change.
Now, in the movie, I got the impression, I've only seen it once at the theater, so, but I got the impression that Joan Baez was more of like a political activist, and that like Masters of War was kind of inspired by her, and that Dylan wasn't, and his nature wasn't to be as directly political, and that she kind of pushed him that way. Was that right?
Well, she was definitely more political than he was and stayed political. I mean, I remember in '67 going to the Big Sur Folk Festival I was working for Judy Collins at the time, and Joan had just married David Harris, who was this anti-war activist, and she had gotten arrested protesting the war, so she was way more political than Bob was. But I do believe that whether it's Masters of War or Only a Pawn in Their Game or all those songs Bob wrote, he really believed about them. I mean, he felt those feelings when Medgar Evers got killed. He was pissed, I mean, so I don't think there was anything phony about it. It's just he changed, and he got, the more people began to hold him up as some savior of the country, the more he got scared. Like, I don't want to be a savior. I'm just a guitar player.
And man, speaking of guitar playing, my understanding is that Timothée Chalamet actually sings and plays guitar in the
He
movie,
does.
and he's really good. I am blown away with
Yeah.
how good the music is.
Yeah. I mean, look, on Sunday, this coming Sunday, I don't know when this is going to come out, but the Oscars are going to happen. And it might be that Timothy wins Best Actor, and secondly, that maybe the movie wins Best Picture, because all these other movies have got all sorts of controversial elements, a
Hmm.
moral, where the trans woman has been trashing
Right.
lots of people, and
She's been, we've arrived when a trans person is canceled for not being sufficiently progressive.
right, and I mean, The Brutalist to me is uh, way too long and very unfocused, and I don't think it's that great a picture. And what? Who knows? Maybe a bunch of the other contenders cancel themselves out, and it for me, it would be great because it says to me that people are interested in this notion of what counterculture can represent in a
Yeah.
society.
I have to say, when I watched that movie, A Complete Unknown, because I used to play in rock bands and stuff when I was
Right.
a teenager or
I,
whatever.
I I see the guitars
You
behind
got the
you.
guitars back here. They're not just decorations.
No.
It gave me a feeling that I hadn't had in decades of what it was like to be young and
Me
whatever,
too.
you know?
Me too, man.
Yeah.
That's why I love it. Yeah.
I have to add, I guess this will probably be our last question, but you were road manager for Dylan and the band, and like I think back in January we lost Garth Hudson, who was the last surviving member of the band. A lot of people focus on Robbie Robertson's songwriting or Levon Helm's voice, but I've recently learned that Garth's musicianship, and he was sort of thought of as this professor or teacher. If you would tell us about that reputation and about Garth.
So when Garth joined the Hawks, it was called Levon and the Hawks, he told his parents that he was going to be a piano teacher. And he was going to
More
teach
respectable.
them a music teacher.
Yeah.
And so he made the rest of the band pay him $10 a week for music lessons. And they took it seriously because he knew so much more about music, and none of them could read music, of course, and knew about harmony and all sorts of other things. And he really did teach them a lot. And the fun thing about Garth was he could play almost any instrument in the world. He had in his house in Woodstock, he must have had 50 instruments. He had saxophones, he had flutes, he had organs, he had pianos, he had guitars. I mean, he could play everything but the drums, and accordions. I mean, just bizarre collection of instruments he had. And he was a genius. He was also a very odd character. He was the first person I knew who on the road could sleep anywhere. He could sleep sitting up in a car, or he could sleep sitting in a uncomfortable airport chair. He would just go to sleep. Like,
That's a good skill to have on
it's
the
a
road.
very good
Yeah.
skill to have. It was quite remarkable.
Well, I have to say, Jonathan Taplin, we have covered a lot of ground, and of all the people I know, and I've had the honor of getting to meet many, many distinguished Americans, I don't think I've ever gotten to know anybody who's had a more interesting life that I could literally just talk to for hours and hours and hours than you. So, let's keep the conversation going. Anything you want to plug or final thoughts?
Yeah, this is the cover of the French version of my book, which has Elon as the shaman, of January 6th. I think that these people are truly dangerous. And I think we have to be careful we don't just kind of slip into this era of the press being not free, people being afraid to talk about what's going on. And when I see how chicken shit big corporate executives are in the face of this, it frightens me.
Yeah. It's called The End of Reality. Everyone should get it if you haven't already. What's the French title?
The Conspiracy of the Billionaires to Destroy Reality.
I think I might like that even better. Well, get that if you speak French, if you speak English, or if you speak American. Get The End of Reality. Jonathan Taplin, great to talk to you again.
Thanks, Matt. That's right.